third time attendee of HerringFest, first time speaker, and I want to thank Grant and Kath and the other members of Conservancy Hornby Island for inviting me to speak today. I grew up on Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral territories in what's now called Southwestern Ontario, and I now live on the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations in Victoria. And I want to thank the Comox and the Qualicum and the Salmon and the other nations who've called this island home for, allowing us to be sort of uninvited guests on this territory. Today, I'm going to be talking about how herring are important to salmon in the Salish Sea. And even though I do have a Master's of Science in Pacific Salmon Ecology, this is not my research. So I'm relying a lot on other people's work, and partly for that reason, I've included Will Duguid, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria in Francis Wanis' lab, because he provided a lot of great data for this presentation. And also because this isn't my work, I'm not obligated to show you very many graphs. So I think I only have 2 graphs in this presentation. No offense to the other presenters today. They've done a lot of great analysis, and it's definitely their duty to show that to you, but I don't have the same obligations. So I guess I'll just start by saying slide. We'll go to the next slide. So I want to situate us a bit here. I thought this would be easier because I thought I'd be able to actually touch this map, but you can see Vancouver in the center here. This is kind of roughly the whole Salish Sea region, and we throw a bunch of terms around to talk about this region, so I just wanted to get a little bit more specific about the areas I'm going to be talking about today. So you can see Vancouver in the largest font sort of in the middle, the area to the left and kind of above that towards Courtney and Campbell River, and a bit below that under where it says Richmond and Surrey, that's kind of what we talk about as the Strait of Georgia. And below that, you'll see the international border, which kind of cuts through that cluster of islands just to the right of Victoria, and that kind of follows the Harrow Strait. So that's what that region is called. If we keep moving down, just sort of below and to the left of Victoria, that's the Juan de Fuca Strait. And when we look down into the US, around Everett and Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia, that we generally call the Puget Sound. So those are some of the areas that I'm going to be talking about today. And really, although herring are important to multiple species of salmon, we heard today Joe mention chum and coho and Chinook. I'm really just going to focus on Chinook today because it's really Chinook that a lot of the conversations are happening about in the public right now, about the conservation implications for Chinook. And in terms of herring and Chinook, these are 2 species. They each have complex life cycles on their own right. Those life cycles bring them in and through this inshore sea that we call the Salish Sea. And that Salish Sea is divided, as you can see, by an international border. And this border affects how the 2 species are understood and managed in this region. Slide. So I'm going to talk first about, just generally about herring populations in the Strait of Georgia. Slide. And this, the herring that come and spawn in this region are considered officially by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, as a single migratory population. So what's understood by that is the adults spend summers feeding off the west coast of Vancouver Island in Queen Charlotte Sound, and then they return to the Strait of Georgia in late fall or early winter, and they congregate in some different winter holding areas around this region. And then they spawn in the spring, like we're starting to see right now. And in early summer, kind of late spring, they swim back out to the coastal shelf. And when we consider it one population, that kind of means that really any of these herring that are spawning in this region, could be able to spawn together, and they're managed as such. Slide. And this is a figure that comes from a DFO document. It's sort of the document that they release every year that kind of summarizes the status of the population in the preceding year and forecasts how it's going to look for the following year. So this is from 2019, forecasting to 2020. And on the y-axis, we have scaled abundance. So that's sort of the number, the amount of herring in thousands of tons. And you have years along the bottom. And the different icons that you see are just sort of indicating how the population was estimated. So before sort of the late 80s, it was mostly done by assessments from the surface, and then there was sort of a transition to using dives. And what we see here is, this population has fluctuated. In the late 60s, around kind of 65 to 70, you see a major dive, and that was right before population sort of crashed all along the BC coast, and the fishery was closed for about 5 years. And it sort of climbed up since then and oscillated a little bit. Right now, forecast for 2020, we're not that far off from where we were in 1951 when these standardized data started. But just to harken back to what Dr. Pauly was saying this morning, this is a pretty short time scale. This is around the time scale we generally have for industrialized fisheries. But if you think that the industrialized fisheries for herring actually started in the 1880s, there's a number of decades here that aren't accounted for. And then there's obviously the millennia before that, the First Nations people were fishing for herring. And those data aren't included here. So this is kind of a place where we can think about that shifting baselines concept. Slide. And while on that regional scale, at the Strait of Georgia scale, maybe herring have been, oscillating but somewhat constant. On the local scale, we've seen very dramatic changes in this region to where herring go and where they spawn. And what I mean by that is that they have been extirpated from or lost from a lot of individual bays, inlets, and shoreline that traditional ecological knowledge and archaeological data have showed us were consistent concentrations of spawn for long periods of time. Slide. So my friend Alex Harris and I, we took a bunch of data on spawning from Fisheries and Oceans. They have a data set online. And all of these blue dots are places that DFO has standardized surveys of herring spawn in the Strait of Georgia. And we basically looked at the time series and said, okay, does, continuous spawn, we'll consider that at least 3 years of spawning happening in one location, 3 years in a row. And where are the places that still have this spawn today? So you can play the video. Oh, if you go back and then just hover your cursor over that. Yeah, there's like a little play button down there at the bottom. Cool. Okay, so it moves kind of slowly here at first, but eventually you start to see some of these dots disappearing. And we haven't done this in chronological order. I think that would be really powerful too. So there's really whole areas of the BC mainland and southwestern Vancouver Island, or southeastern Vancouver Island, sorry, that no longer have this continuous spawn today. It's very rare now to see consistent spawning south of Nanaimo. And many of these are important spawning areas that have now been lost. Slide. So this reduction in spawning extent, or the change in the distribution of spawn, is also, we can think of it as a reduction in the diversity and the resilience of the herring population in the Strait of Georgia. So Dan Okamoto, who is a professor at Florida State University, along with Phil Levin and Tessa Francis from the University of Washington, worked on this project called the Ocean Modeling Forum, and they looked at both ecological, economic, and social sort of benefits that come from herring spawns. And they found that we're losing resilience of the population of herring, and we're also losing availability of herring on a finer scale to the ecosystem and to communities in those places. And the herring that we're losing potentially have unique biological and ecological characteristics that are important to the resilience of the overall population. Slide. So I want to talk a bit about that idea that this population is migratory. There's evidence from traditional knowledge, local knowledge from communities spread around the Strait of Georgia, and also fisheries catches that at least some of the herring that spawn in the Strait of Georgia are actually residents. And what that means is that rather than swimming out to those coastal areas to the west coast of Vancouver Island, they reside in this inshore sea year-round. Slide. And this is a table from a 1990 report from DFO that kind of categorizes, the first column is sections, so that's just the fisheries management area. They have numbers for all of these regions. And then you have non-migratory spawning locations and migratory spawning locations. And you can see under migratory spawning locations, it might be hard to read at the back, but you see places like Cape Lazo, Crome Island, Comox Bay, Denman Island. We have Hornby Island, Comas Bluff, Lambert Channel. And then in non-migratory spawning locations, you have Bain Sound, Buckley Bay, Deep Bay, Fanny Bay. And really up until the 1990s, DFO kind of classified these locations of herring spawn as being resident or migratory. And many of the places, it's not so much true here because this is kind of the epicenter of where herring still continue to spawn in the Strait of Georgia. But if I showed you parts of this table from other regions, like the Southern Gulf Island, you'd see that a lot of those locations called non-migratory or resident locations no longer have consistent spawn. And I think one of the reasons that DFO now considers this population migratory is that in the early 2000s, there were a number of genetics and tagging studies done that suggested herring move kind of unpredictably between spawning locations, and that there's not that much genetic difference between herring that spawn in different areas. So this created some scientific uncertainty about the structure of the population in the Strait of Georgia. And I think that's kind of where this idea that it's a single migratory population came from. But stubbornly, there are still adult herring that live as residents in the Salish Sea that stay here year-round. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Slide. And so I think it's important to talk a bit about the Puget Sound as well, because this idea that, you know, these two areas are very different is kind of a human construct. Slide. So this is the Puget Sound. I can't remember what I wanted to say about this slide. Please continue. Okay, oh yes, I do know what I wanted to say, which is that herring are managed quite differently south of the border. And Joe kind of alluded to this. Pacific herring were included in the 1974 Bolt decision. This is a US federal district ruling that defined treaty tribes fisheries rights. And so one difference is that Washington state and tribal governments co-manage herring stocks and herring fisheries. And these are 21 different locations where herring spawn that are considered subpopulations of herring within the Puget Sound. And these stocks are distinguished partly, they vary in abundance. They don't appear to have a lot of recruitment from stock to stock, so we don't see, if we have a really high year in one place, we don't see a lot of those fish moving to adjacent locations. They sometimes differ in the month that they actually spawn and the timing of the emergence of larvae, so the tiniest of herring. And slide. They also differ in migration strategies. So there's been some research using a number of different tools that have looked at how much these fish actually migrate. And it's kind of hard to see it at the very top. You can see Semiahmoo Bay and Cherry Point, and then also Quilcene Bay down here in the middle, highlighted in red. These are considered some of the most migratory stocks. Slide. And then down here in the bottom in light blue, we have Port Orchard, Port Madison, and Squaxin Pass. These are considered more residents, and the other populations are maybe somewhere in between. Slide. And this is a figure taken from a report that came out last year that is summarizing sort of the state of Washington state herring leading up to 2016. And it's sort of broken down by a bunch of different stocks. So the top line, Southern Salish Sea total, that's all of the herring in Puget Sound. And then they've broken out, Cherry Point is in red. You can see it declines quite substantially from 1973 to 2015. We have Squaxin, which is that other genetically distinct stock in black along the bottom that's just hovering at a pretty low level. And then we have this green stock, Hood Canal, the herring that spawned Hood Canal, that's kind of at a low level, and then recently has taken quite a bit of a spike. And so although collectively Puget Sound herring are defined as healthy, that status is mostly driven by a 225% increase in these fish that spawn in Hood Canal. So although this traditional model of assessment of kind of looking at herring on the regional level is sort of what is done in the Strait of Georgia, it can obscure important trends on kind of the subpopulation level. And in 2016, that subpopulation in the Hood Canal basically made up half of the biomass of all the herring in Puget Sound. Slide, stock. Actually, can you go back for a sec? That Cherry Point is quite interesting too. That's one that I said is genetically distinct. That's partly because they spawn much later than the other herring that spawn in Puget Sound, and they've declined over 96% since 1973. You can see on the figure that they're much reduced, and there's really been no sign of recovery. Okay, slide. All right, so we're gonna focus on the king of salmon, Chinook here. Slide. And the Pacific Salmon Commission, which is a body that includes the US and Canada, reported a 60% reduction in Salish Sea Chinook abundance from 1984 to 2010. And that decline, that 60% reduction, sort of overlapped with a period from the 1970s to the early 1990s, where there was actually a doubling of the number of Chinook smolts, both hatchery and wild, entering the Strait of Georgia. So there's something going on here between sort of smolts and the adult life stage. Southern BC has 28 different Chinook populations. Nearly half of them are listed as threatened, endangered, or special concern. The Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSEWIC, just sort of evaluated the status of these populations in 2018. And in the Puget Sound, there are 22 Chinook populations that are collectively listed as threatened, along with like 26 hatchery programs. So I'm really focusing as much as I can on wild fish in this kind of conversation here, but there's also this whole aspect in this region of Chinook populations being pretty heavily subsidized by hatcheries. Slide. So Chinook are born in fresh water. They migrate to the ocean where they grow as adults for 2 to 5 years, and then they return to spawn. And broadly speaking, Chinook kind of have two different lifestyles. In practice, there's really a continuum because fish don't read the fisheries textbooks. They never like to follow the rules, but I'm just going to describe these two extremes. So we have the ocean type Chinook, and these fish migrate to the ocean pretty much within their first 3 months of life. So they come to estuaries very small as fry and sub-yearling smolts, and they spend quite a lot of time in estuaries sort of feeding and growing before they enter deeper waters of the Salish Sea. And then during their kind of adult life cycle, they spend a lot of that time in coastal waters, so up and down the shelf, kind of into Washington waters, the west coast of Vancouver Island, up into other parts of BC, but also some as residents of the Salish Sea, staying in here year-round. Slide. And the other sort of broad category is stream-type Chinook. So these fish live in freshwater as juveniles for 1 year or more, which means that when they swim downstream into the ocean, they're much larger than those ocean-type Chinook that I showed you before. So these fish can move into the deeper areas of the Salish Sea pretty quickly. And they spend about 3 to 4 months there, maybe up until September of that year, and then they just go. They leave the Salish Sea, they have an extensive offshore migration that takes them out into the North Pacific as adults. Slide. And these things, these differences in life history, I talk about these because they affect the diet of these fish when they are juveniles in this region. So Chinook salmon are pretty opportunistic. They will eat, for the most part, what is available with some limits. And that means that their diets vary depending on the year, the location where they are, and even within the season. So for ocean-type Chinook, those little guys, when they first arrive in estuaries, they're eating a lot of insects and amphipods, crab larvae, krill. Slide. You can see they're pretty small. You can't really see the mouth on this one, but it's not very big. You can't fit a lot in there. Slide. Here, this is just showing some of the different life stages and life strategies of Chinook. So you have everything from a small fry up to a smolt, a subadult, and then an adult. And, well, not even an adult, that's like a small. So you can see there's a real difference in size. And for fish, this is what we talk about as gape limitation. So the size of your mouth can really affect what you're able to eat. And as these ocean type Chinook, the ones that come into the strait as small fry, as they grow, they start to move into offshore areas. And as they get bigger, they're able to start consuming fish. So juvenile herring enter the diet of these fish late in the summer of that first year, and only the largest of the Chinook can eat them. They really have to be big enough to eat them. So there's a size advantage to being larger for these little fish. In comparison, stream type Chinook that are entering the ocean when they're already over a year old, they're much larger, they're going straight into the deeper areas of the Salish Sea. They eat juvenile herring basically from the time they enter the ocean. So you see juvenile herring in their diets like as early as June. Slide. Okay, so Russell Barsh, who I believe lives on Orcas, he and a nonprofit called Quiet, so they have a number of volunteers. They've been sampling juvenile Chinook in the San Juan Islands basically from 2009 to 2017, and they focused on 2 different locations. So up at the top, you can see a white, well, hopefully you can see a white arrow that's pointing to the west side of Waldron Island, and down here near the bottom, you can see an arrow pointing to the east side of the bottom of Lopez. And they found that those fish that are being caught up on Waldron, a lot of those are from the Fraser River. They're really in the plume of the outmigration from the Fraser. And the ones down here on Lopez, a lot of those are coming from the Puget Sound. So they're migrating up out of the Puget Sound. And for fish caught in the San Juan Islands, about 80% of the diet of these juvenile Chinook is fish, and 98% of those fish is herring and sand lance. So Joe spoke about this earlier. He alluded to the real importance of herring for Chinook, and that is something that we see consistently year after year, that when herring are available, the fish are eating them. Slide. This is a still from a video that Tavish Campbell shot, and I wanted to include the video because it's very beautiful, but I had some trouble downloading it with the Wi-Fi that was available to me. So just to give you a sense that in some parts of the water column, like up near the top of the surface, in some places in the Salish Sea, juvenile herring are the most abundant forage fish. They just really dominate the landscape. And in areas where these small herring are abundant, juvenile Chinook that are feeding on them have higher growth rates. And this is important because the Chinook that are bigger by the July of their first summer in Puget Sound have significantly higher small to adult survival. So this availability of herring is something that's really impacting the ability of juvenile Chinook to make it through this bottleneck that's thought to kind of shape the ultimate abundance of adult salmon. Slide. Okay. As adults, Chinook kind of continue this generalist feeding behavior. They're like the person who goes up to the buffet and they're like, oh, there's a bunch of different stuff here. I'll just try a bunch of things. But they continue to have some focus depending on what food is available in the regions where they are. Slide. So this is from some work that Will Duguid, who I mentioned earlier, is a PhD student at UVic. They started looking at what was the data available on adult Chinook diets. And the most recent studies that they found were from the 1980s, and they were mostly concentrated on the spring, summer, and fall months. And so they really wanted to look at what are adult Chinook eating in this region throughout the year. So they basically put the word out to sport fishermen and said, hey, send us the stomachs of the Chinook that you catch. We just want to see what's in those stomachs. So they've been doing this for a couple of years now, for 3 years, and there's some really interesting spatial patterns here. So in the southern Gulf Islands, Haro Strait, and the Juan de Fuca, which are the regions kind of indicated by those white arrows, sand lance can be close to 50% of the diet in the summer. And I know that when you were eating your lunch, you were like, I really hope there's some pictures of some partially digested fish that I can look at later. That's what you're gonna see. So these are sand lance that were taken from the stomach of an adult Chinook, just as an example. Slide. And then in Howe Sound and around the lower mainland, northern anchovy have been up to 30% of the diet. And this is kind of interesting because it reflects this surge in northern anchovy that people have been witnessing in these areas. And it's really just this phenomenon of Chinook eating these anchovies is really constrained to this particular area around Howe Sound because that's sort of where the anchovy are present, and they're not really present anywhere else in these large numbers. So Chinook really aren't eating them in other places. Slide. And then interestingly, in the summer of 2019, there was sort of a lot of squid available in Barkley Sound. So some of the Chinook that were caught off of the west coast of Vancouver Island had a lot of squid in their stomachs. So that's what a partially digested squid looks like, in case you were wondering. Slide. But when we look at the Strait of Georgia, herring are still by far the most important prey for adult Chinook. And there's something really interesting happening in the summer in the northernmost part of the Strait of Georgia, where adult Chinook are only eating fish. 100% of their diet is fish, and 95% of that diet is adult herring. But these are the summer months, so these are the months where, in that understanding of the herring life cycle that I talked about at the very beginning, herring are supposed to be out, on the edge of the coastal shelf, off the west coast of Vancouver Island. They're not supposed to be in the Strait of Georgia, but somehow these adult Chinook are eating them. So that raises some questions, slide, about resident herring. And so there's some possible explanations for this. Either resident herring are rare and Chinook are just very good at finding them, which they probably are. That's something that they're really born to do. But another explanation is that resident herring are playing a much larger and sort of underappreciated role in the Strait of Georgia ecosystem than is sort of conventionally understood. So the data from Will's study, where 95% of the diet was adult herring, that was consistent over 3 years, over 350 Chinook that they sampled. So there's a pretty strong signal there, at least in the most recent years. And he did say, like, anecdotally talking to sport fishermen, that adult herring have seemed to be a lot more common in the Strait of Georgia in the last few years during this sampling. So, and that these resident herring that are being observed seem to be concentrated in areas that line up really well with hot spots for recreational Chinook fishing. So the fish know something, and the people catching the fish know something too, and that these herring are sort of deep during the day and then feeding on the surface at night, which is what we might expect from a forage fish. Okay, slide. So those data that I was talking about are predominantly from ocean-type Chinook. So these are the Chinook that are sort of coastal as adults. They're spending a lot more time in coastal areas. They might be resident to the Strait of Georgia or the Salish Sea. And stream-type Chinook behave quite differently as adults. They move out into that North Pacific after maybe just a summer in the Strait of Georgia. When they return, they appear quite abruptly on the south coast. And we know this from fisheries data, commercial fisheries that are catching these fish, that they show up in pulses in April, May, June, and they tend to enter their spawning rivers relatively quickly. So these fish, when they're caught in fisheries, are caught with a higher frequency of empty stomachs. These are migrating salmon, and we know that when salmon are migrating, they're very directed. They're not eating as much as they would if they were sort of holding in different parts of the environment. So for these stream-type Chinook, in contrast, the food that's available in the Strait of Georgia is not really that important to their adult growth and fecundity. They're getting a lot more of that adult mass out in the open ocean, and they're really just entering the Strait of Georgia late in that spawning life before they enter the river. So they're eating a little bit, but they're not eating as much as the ocean type. And this is interesting because these fish that have this stream type lifestyle tend to be the Chinook stocks from the upper Fraser and the middle Fraser. So the fish with the longer migrations up to these headwater spawning streams. And these are the stocks that are being evaluated as endangered or threatened. So whether there's that strong correlation between their life cycle and how those threats are playing out, it's an important thing to consider. But these are also stocks of Chinook that are quite important to southern resident killer whales. So there's sort of a complexity there around how herring are contributing to the survival and growth and abundance of adult Chinook that really depends on the lifestyle of the Chinook stocks that we're talking about. Okay, slide. And so I want to talk about some of the other ecological interactions that Chinook salmon and herring have. Slide, I think. Yes, oh, hello. So there is a potential for competition between juvenile herring and juvenile Chinook salmon that's been documented in the literature. A lot of this comes from sort of speculation, but herring, well, not speculation, but herring and Chinook overlap in space and in time. This research is from the Puget Sound, and both of these fish are generalists in their diet to some extent. So there's a pretty significant overlap in the things that they're eating. I hope that art piece is still worth the amount that it was supposed to be for. Okay, it's fine. So both juvenile herring and juvenile Chinook eat things like crab larvae, krill, copepods, amphipods. Both of them have some variability in what they're eating, but there is an overlap in the types of prey items that they're searching for. And because juvenile herring are so much more abundant than juvenile Chinook, they can remove substantially more of those prey items in the areas where the species overlap. So there is a possibility that juvenile Chinook could be food limited, that they'll be able to grow less as juveniles during that first year, and that could affect their survival. So that's a component of how these species cohabitate this space. Slide. And then also getting at some of these ecosystem interactions that Joe was talking about in terms of how different species are predating on each other. So, slide. We know that harbor seals, there's a lot of harbor seal fans out there. This species has really been criticized quite a bit for predating on juvenile Chinook, adult Chinook, also juvenile and adult herring. And these seals have sort of kind of seasonal focuses on what they're eating. So in February to April, they may be focusing on the adult herring that are coming back to spawn, that are really heavily congregated in certain areas. And then in May and June, they might be switching to these wild and hatchery release smolts that are coming in pretty high abundances out of Chinook salmon streams. Slide. So theoretically, when herring are more abundant, seals are less likely to predate juvenile Chinook that are coming out of rivers. There's more herring available. You know, if both are equivalent to the seal, why not eat the herring? It's harder to find the Chinook. They're that needle in a haystack. Slide. Oh, actually, go back. I'm not ready for that yet. But this effect might actually be size dependent. So there's some research done that came out of Andrew Treit's lab at UBC that suggests that seals have sort of a preferred size range for their prey. And so there may be something going on where if juvenile herring are abundant, they are competing with each other for food. And those herring are each going to be smaller on average. That's good for Chinook because you'll remember that only the largest Chinook can eat herring. So if herring are smaller, more Chinook can eat herring from an earlier age. They're going to be able to grow bigger. But seals might also prefer smaller herring, which could also reduce predation on Chinook. So there might be a twofold benefit to Chinook when herring are in high abundance. But then when herring are lower in abundance and are larger, the seals may be keying in on the Chinook smolts instead. So there's some different interactions happening between these three species that could really affect the level of predation that's happening on Chinook smolts. That's probably really significant in the mouths of rivers that are producing a lot of Chinook smolts where seals can learn to just hang out and pick them off. Slide. So how important are herring to Chinook? In the Strait of Georgia, the marine survival of Chinook salmon is strongly correlated to the proportion of young of the year herring in their diet. That's a quote from R. Sweeting from the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project. So herring are very important to young Chinook salmon. If herring are in the right place at the right time and they're the right size, Chinook are going to eat a lot of them, and the more herring that Chinook can eat, the more likely they are to survive. Slide. And adult Chinook eat herring year-round in the Strait of Georgia. So they're particularly important in the summer And just to reiterate that there's something going on with resident herring here. There are adult herring that are present in the Strait of Georgia in the summer, and those are a major food source for adult Chinook in certain parts of the Strait of Georgia, particularly in the northern areas. Slide. But there's still a lot of unknowns about fine-scale predation patterns, and even though we've dug really deeply just into these basically two species that are interacting, I really want to reiterate what Joe was saying about how complex this ecosystem is. And you don't maybe get a great sense of that from this talk, although the life history diversity that we see among these species is an important factor in how they interact. But they are inhabiting a much larger system with a lot of other species that are also, consuming them, being consumed by them, competing with them, interacting with them in different ways. And there's a lot of unknowns about the fine scale patterns of predation. So how are juvenile herring distributing around the Strait of Georgia as spawning patterns change? So we have a big spawn, maybe right out here in this region. We have a whole bunch of eggs. Those fish emerge as larvae, and they're being transported by currents around this basin that has a lot of complexity in how water moves through it, because we have all of these different islands. We have really narrow entry points for that water. So I think this is something that's not known very well. And that distribution of the spawning herring is changing. We don't maybe know a lot about how larval herring are being distributed, but those things are going to affect the availability of larval herring to Chinook stocks that are spawning in different places. So just as sort of a really quick comparison here, you can look at Big Qualicum. This river has, is pumping out hatchery Chinook smolts. They're really well situated. They're emerging into the Salish Sea, basically in the midst of all these juvenile herring that have just hatched in Lambert Channel. But those fish don't have 30 times the marine survival of Chinook smolts from other rivers. Then you have Cowichan Chinook that were in a really precipitously low place 10 years ago. They're now back to historic highs. They've recovered really dramatically, but there is no consistent herring spawn in Cowichan. So are larval herring being moved into that area, or are those fish feeding on something else? There's a lot that we don't really understand about these trends in Chinook abundance. I also just want to touch on the southern resident killer whales, because I know that's an important issue that a lot of people think about. These whales depend on different stocks of Chinook to different degrees. And so we know that southern residents are eating Chinook that come from rivers on the east coast of Vancouver Island, from within the Fraser River, from the Puget Sound, but they depend on those stocks to different degrees at different times, depending on when those fish are available, and those stocks are interacting with Chinook or with herring in different ways. So there's a lot of complexity to this, but I think the take-home message is that, herring are really important to the survival of Chinook salmon. Slide. And I'm going to do a shout out for Will, because we had some really great conversations about this past week. For any sports fishers here, there's going to be some Chinook closures this summer, but if you're someone who's fishing for Chinook and catching Chinook throughout the year, you should consider sending the stomachs to Will so that they can continue this project, because they have 3 more years of funding, and they're really aiming for a 20-year data set as a way of ecologically monitoring this region, how forage communities are doing, and basically using Chinook salmon as a sampling method. Chinook are traveling through this area, they're finding different things to eat, and if we can take the stomachs of those Chinook, we can get a sense of how those different prey communities are doing. So all you have to do is email juanaslabmanager@gmail.com, and you can get some more info. Slide. Oh yeah, take a photo if you'd like. Or you can ask me about it and I'll tell you. So I just want to finish by thanking all of you for listening and acknowledging some of the people whose research I leaned on pretty heavily for this talk. Among them, people from NOAA, the USGS, Quiet, University of Washington, and the University of Victoria. With that, I guess I'm done. Thank you.